I'm not even skeptical yet. I'm just like, I want to get to the bottom of this. I would track down the articles cited in support of the claim that stereotypes are inaccurate. I would get those articles. When I would read those articles, there would be the claim that stereotypes are inaccurate, with neither empirical evidence nor citation to an article with empirical evidence.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with psychologist Dr. Lee Jussim, and I'm ready for a fantastic conversation. So welcome, doctor.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I guess we'll start off with, I have not seen you post in Psychology Today in a while, or write the articles in a while. Why is that?
Well, why questions are always complicated, but the short answer is I basically resigned from posting at Psych Today about 3 years ago. I wrote for them for about almost 10 years, and it was a good run, actually. When my interest in doing that were I had two related goals. One was to bring psychology and my understanding of methodological and research rigor to a wider public, which is kind of hard because methodology makes people's eyes glaze over, sort of statistics. So this was a challenge. But that relates to my second goal, which was to learn how to communicate to normal people instead of just academics. Up until that, I started writing for them in 2013, 2014, and I really had only written academic articles. And they're very technical and jargony, and, they're written for other academics. And I wanted to learn how to write more broadly. And what better way to learn how to do it than to make myself do it? So I started blogging for Psych Today. And for most of the time, until about 2022 or so, I think 2022, well, 2020, I think, is when I left. Until around 2020, so it was 2013 or 14 to 2020, it was great. I would write pretty much whatever I wanted. Every once in a while, an editor would catch an absolute error, like I had the wrong name for a person or something like that. And I was grateful. It's good to have that stuff corrected. So that was fine. But then around 2020, it was about 2 years of me sort of enduring this before I said, yeah, this is not going away. It's actually getting worse. They started engaging in what they would probably describe as heightened editorial review of the blog posts, and what I experienced as a mix of both insane picayune nonsense that was not justified, stuff that was close to censorship. So a lot of what I write about runs against the sort of far left social justice vein of work in the social sciences. So just to give a sense of that, without going into the details, although I'm happy to go into this, I've published academic articles as well as Psych Today pieces on the accuracy of stereotypes. A lot of people don't want to hear about the accuracy of stereotypes. I've published a very kind of brutal critique of research on microaggressions, describing most of it as nonsense and not credible. Not that there is no such thing as microaggressions, but that's a different issue than whether the quality of the research attempting to address it. I've published critiques of the concept and research on implicit bias. I've posted at Psych Today on the lack of credibility deserved by stereotype threat research. I'm not going to explain. I can explain that, but I'm not going to explain it. And I have a series of posts on, there's more than just this, but at Psych Today, I have a series of posts on alternatives to sexism as explanations for why there is a fairly large gender gap in STEM fields. So in many STEM fields, there's way more men than women. The go-to explanation on the social justice left is sexist bias, and that might play a role. I'm not, averse to there being that sex against women playing some role, but there's a lot of evidence that lots of other things also play. play a role in that. So that just gives your listeners a flavor when I say I kind of do all this stuff that sort of cuts against social justice narratives, stuff like that. And that was fine. But then around 2020, of course, 2020, right? George Floyd's murder, and the whole country goes crazy. There's sort of a moral panic over racism. Just that I would describe it as a moral panic over racism is exactly the kind of thing that would get me in trouble at Psych Today starting around 2020. So the editors would intervene, and they didn't like my language about this or that. And some of it was just picayune. It's picayune and stupid. Like it's picayune and they were basically right, but this is just picayune and stupid. So as one example, and they would hold up my posts. So like again, from 2000, let's say it's 2014. It might have been 13, but from 2014 to 2020, I would post something and that would be it. It would just be up, and I'd have my blog post. I would tweet about it or something, and that would be that. Okay, fine. But no, now they were not posting it. They were like, I would post it, it would not appear. I'd get some comment from the editor. And here's just one example of the kind of nonsense. I was told that, so one of the things I study is political extremism, political intolerance. In the academic literature, people are described as being left-wing or right-wing. I mean, they're centrists and people who don't neatly fit into a left-right dichotomy. But, routinely, the academic literature refers to people on the left and people on the right, or people who are left-wing and right-wing. So I'd do some post on some of the stuff, and some low-grade editor, which is just really, when I say low-grade editor, typically these people don't have advanced degrees, which does not make you smart or dumb, but it does mean you're not particularly experienced at writing. That is usually what that means. And you have almost no expertise in social science. I mean, you have a BA. It's like, right? So, okay. So I get this comment that referring to people as left-wing is an insult. And I'm like, what? And so, I needed to revise the thing. So I didn't revise the thing. What I did was I compiled a response with, 5 or 10 academic papers that refer to people as either left-wing or right-wing. And I said, I'm not going to change it because this is how it is discussed in the academic literature. And then they let it through. But now, instead of just writing a post, let's say it's 1,000 or 1,200 word post, it might take me a few hours to write such a post. Now I'm dealing with it not being up and asking questions why and getting a response and having to compile. This is like adding another 2 hours to post one 1,200 word essay. So it was just ridiculous. It was just irritating. Okay. So that's just picayune nonsense. But what started happening is they started objecting to every one of these sort of contra social justice narrative posts. They didn't like this, they didn't like that, they don't like my tone, they want to change the title. And around this time, it's like 2020, 2021, Stack they might have launched earlier, but they were becoming more prominent, more well-known, some very famous people were on it. And so it was also seemed clear, which turned out to be true, that Substack engages in not quite no content moderation, but almost none. Their mission is to be a forum for people to express their thoughts and ideas, and so they very rarely intervene in posts. So whilst still having the Psych Today blog site, I started the Substack, and it was really easy. And nobody bothered me. And what I discovered was I got paid a hell of a lot more.
Really?
Yeah, so you don't get paid by Substack, but you can have so most of my posts are free on my for your listeners. I posted Unsafe Science on Substack. It's easy to find me there. The title is consistent with everything I just described. I publish on the same kind of things I was doing. It's like today, but I do a small number of posts that are for paid subscribers. So I have a more than small, but not gigantic paid subscriber group. And I get paid off of that. I get paid 30 times as much from that as I ever got paid from Psych Today. So, I got paid off my first post off the paid subscriptions from that first post that I got paid from a year of posts at Psych Today. So it's like, I'm done. I'm just completely done. But this was the cherry on top.
So, Dr. Jussim, I've
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead. You can finish
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
thought.
So what really got me in trouble was, and I'm looking for it right now, tweeted I tweeted something about Psych Today, and I can't find it now. Oh, right, there we go. Okay, so I tweeted this. This was about my last post at Psych Today. It was on microaggressions. It was a critique of microaggressions. And here's the tweet. The draft post ran afoul of the Psych Today editorial micro sensibilities. Bad example. Remove scare quotes, because they put scare quotes around microaggressions. They said, I led with an example of bad service at a restaurant. And I show below. Okay, so this got me in trouble because there's some part of the Psych Today contract that says you cannot criticize Psych Today. And I'm like, I'm done. This is it. I absolutely want to criticize Psych Today. I have my Substack going. I'm going to criticize Psych Today. There's nothing they can do about it. And that was it. That was the last time I ever.
So, Dr. Justin, I've read a good bit of your stuff. You seem to be extremely rigorous in digging into the methodology of these type of studies and pulling out, like research methods in a way that's just very rigorous. I quoted you in my book. Like I really like, how rigorous your thinking is. But it seems like the level of rigor in your thinking was not the issue. It seems like the issue was you crossed an invisible line in the sand about like kind of a holy and sacred orthodoxy. And it's like, you shouldn't have to be told this. Like that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitating only because they never actually blocked a post. They just made it increasingly difficult to post and wanted changes to walk back some of my framing in those posts. So, did it cross a line? It probably did. But they never, well, actually that's not completely true. I had one post which was sort of an updating. Amber Bierce in the 19th century had the Devil's Dictionary. So we would take normal concepts and give them these sort of humorous and ironic definitions. And I don't have any at my fingertips, but the tone would be, actually, this is a Mark Twain quote. He was a member of Congress and he was an idiot, but I repeat myself. So that was the tone of Ambrose' Devil Dictionary. So I wrote this thing called the Orwell Lexicon, which is how people twist the meaning of words to make, usually to make political points. So the very first entry in the Orwell Lexicon is Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's disease is a condition where people who proclaim the need and value for diversity, equity, and inclusion forget those values as soon as someone disagrees with anything they've written. And then attempt to demonize, denounce and punish such a person. So that's Alzheimer's disease. And it just goes on from there like that. So I actually tried to post that at Site Today, and they would not allow it. So now they argued that, this has nothing to do with science, and that was not completely true, because some of the entries were actually based on the scientific literature, although Alzheimer's is something I simply made up. But there were plenty of entries that actually were based on social science. So, for example, one of the entries is the bias. So Geert Gigerenzer is a very prominent European psychologist who has spent much of his career arguing and demonstrating empirically that a lot of what psychologists claim are biases, irrationalities in how people make decisions and judgments, are actually exceedingly functional and are as good or better than formal statistical models in real life much of the time. So that's his life's work, basically.
Is that stereotype accuracy?
Well, he never addressed stereotype accuracy, but that would fit with his general perspective. But he also coined the term bias to refer to social scientists who just seem to love work on bias and exaggerate the extent of bias and overinterpret the meaning of studies that find bias. So bias is in the Orwell lexicon.
Interesting. So, on that theme of bias, I'm in a grad program for clinical mental health counseling, and we talk about the implicit association test, we talk about microaggressions, we talk about stereotype threat. These things are assumed to be scientifically sound. There's no even hint that this might be questioned. What can you tell me about those three?
Well, I mean, first place, as soon as somebody, there are what I was going to say is as soon as somebody tells you something can't be questioned, that's what you should be questioning. That's what I was going to say. Now, they're probably, first of all, that's probably literally true. But there are certain things that, you know, you can question these things also. In fact, that's probably healthy to do that. But there are really good answers to things like how old is the Earth? So the Earth is not 6,000 years old. So it's like humans and dinosaurs didn't walk on the Earth at the same time. So there are certain things that are simply facts that are so well established that it is basically absurd to believe anything else or deeply ignorant. But if it's deeply ignorant, then there are really good reasons. And, the job of people like me would be to communicate what those reasons are. But most social science doesn't have the same status as paleontology or most of geology, right? So there's almost nothing in social science. There may be a few things, but there's very few things anywhere near as sound as the age of the Earth. So they all should be questioned. And in fact, what was just implicit bias and the research on microaggressions is just a minor to a major disaster area. I mean, I could go. There's like a zillion aspects to it. I'll give just one because I could just go on, and that'll just get boring and I'll lose people. A microaggression is when one person says or does something to let's just so I can keep this clear. A first person says or does something to a second person that constitutes some kind of subtle or underhanded insult, typically based on some sort of demographic category, race or ethnicity, could be sex, could be, almost any kind of demographics or group identity. You would think if this was a strong, solid area of scientific research, there would be lots of evidence on the ways in which people perpetrate microaggressions, because microaggressions, by definition, are an act by the perpetrator, by some perpetrator. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. Almost none of the research studies perpetrators. It's all about people's perceptions of microaggressions. Now, there's a vast bodies of literature in psychology, empirical studies in psychology, showing that people's judgments are imperfect, they can be self-serving, they can be out of touch with things that are going on around them. There are all sorts of common cognitive, mental shortcuts and fallibilities that people have that render the simple presumption that because someone perceives something, it's necessarily true, untenable. I mean, they might be right. I mean, sometimes people perceive things that are true, but you can't assume something is true just because somebody says so. I mean,
It's
this is such common sense that it's obvious when stated this way, but almost none of the research on microaggressions studies perpetrators. It almost all studies people's perceptions.
It's so bizarre that this is pretty much purely rooted in subjectivity. So, like in my textbooks, things that are considered microaggressions is just anything that could potentially offend someone. So, saying America's the land of opportunity, I think men and women are equal, I think the best person should get the job. Pretty standard ideas that people might say on a common day-to-day basis are considered like horrifically offensive because someone could potentially theoretically be offended by that.
Yeah. So continuing, there's no evidence in the microaggression literature that people routinely interpret those kind of statements as racist or insulting. There may be context. There may be times when they do, and there might even be times when I would agree it is intended as an insult. That's probably the case. But that such cases exist is a different America's a melting pot, as a microaggression.
Yeah. What about what can you tell me about the implicit bias test, implicit association?
So the core, can we assume your readers know what that is? Or should I
Yes,
explain it?
it's the test done on a computer that supposedly tells you if you have kind of unconscious. I guess there's multiple different tests, but the most popular one is to see if you have unconscious racism.
Right, there's the implicit association test, which is by far the most common measure of what is routinely called implicit bias, which is a misnomer, even though some of my papers use the term, because otherwise people wouldn't know what we were talking about. But let me explain why it's a misnomer. But to explain why it's a misnomer, your listeners need to understand what the test actually is. There's actually lots of different kinds of implicit association tests. The idea is that it's supposed to, it is intended to assess the difference in strength of association between paired concepts. Okay, so what the hell does that mean? In the most basic IAT, the racial attitudes IAT, it's performed on a computer. And people will see something like left side, black/good, or black/pleasant. Yeah, let's go with black/pleasant. And on the right side, they'll see white/unpleasant. And then words will come up on the computer, like butterflies, or vomit, or garbage, or rainbows. And so when butterflies come up, butterflies are good. So they go to the black good category. So, right. And then there might be names. There'd be names like Jeffrey or Jamal and so forth and so on. And so, Jeffrey would go into white, but Jamal would go to black. And so there's this parade of words and names, and people have to categorize them into either black good or black pleasant or white unpleasant. Then they do it again with the things flipped. So instead of black pleasant, white unpleasant, it becomes black unpleasant, white pleasant. They do the same thing, vomit and Jamal and rainbows. And their job is just to, using a keyboard, place these words into these double categories. The idea is that if it's easier, that is, it takes less time for people to put vomit unpleasant versus white pleasant, then it takes for them to put vomit into black pleasant, white unpleasant. If that takes short time in the first, that means it's easier because the idea is black and unpleasant is kind of the same thing relative to white pleasant, which is also kind of the same thing, and that black pleasant and white unpleasant are not really that closely related. That's the idea. There are issues with that, which I'm not even going to get into. But at its best, what it assesses is the association of these concepts, pleasantness and whiteness and unpleasantness and blackness, in memory. That's right. The outcome from this test is how quickly it takes people to categorize these words into white pleasant, black unpleasant versus white unpleasant, black pleasant. For most people, it absolutely takes longer to categorize words into white unpleasant, black pleasant than into white pleasant, black unpleasant. Yet that it takes longer to do it, is routinely interpreted with some justification as evidence that there's a stronger association in memory between blackness and unpleasantness and whiteness and pleasantness versus blackness, unpleasantness, blackness, pleasantness, and white unpleasant. That's the idea. So at its best, there's technical issues with that, which I'm not going to go into, but I could. I'm happy to do that also. But at its best, it's testing the strength of association of these concepts in memory. Whether this is a bias of any kind it's a misnomer. That people have associations between concepts in memory is not any kind of bias. And that is all that the test assesses. Although it does get worse from there. I mean, you're absolutely right that 30 years ago, when the test was first developed, it was widely interpreted as revealing unconscious racism. About 10 years ago, research started coming out showing that if you tell people what about the IET and what it does and how it does, they're very good at predicting their scores, which means they know what their scores are going to be, which means there's nothing unconscious about it. And the more recent scholarship, even by some of the advocates, has had to acknowledge this, does acknowledge it, and they really have retreated from the whole concept of unconscious racism and now talk about beliefs and attitudes, whether it's about blacks and whites or men and women, or it could be gays and straights, or it could be about religious groups, ethnic groups, it could be about any combination of groups. It doesn't even have to be about groups, it could be about other things. They talk about it as being directly versus indirectly measured. And what that means is I could ask you, to rate black people and white people on a scale from 0 to 100. Really a very common measurement for doing that is what's called a feeling thermometer. So we rate how cold or warm, 0 very cold, 100 very warm, how you feel to black people, white people, Latinos, Jews, men, women. You can just do this with any group. That's a direct measure because you're asking people. The IAT is an indirect measure because you're not asking people about their attitudes. You're inferring it from this strength of association.
That's so fast. The first thing that came up to me is I'm thinking, as you're explaining this is so complicated, and I think one of the big things people complain about in this test, it's like, I got confused with the instructions. I didn't know which key I was supposed to hit on the keyboard. And then it comes out, it's like, turns out you're super racist, dude.
Yeah. There are other issues with it. So the a lot of the rhetoric when it first came out was that it revealed unconscious racism, that like 70 or 80% of the country shows evidence of being unconscious racist. And so all sorts of legal and policy remedies were necessary to deal with this ongoing, pervasive unconscious racism throughout the society. But all of that's had to be walked back for all sorts of reasons. The IET may measure attitudes to some degree, but not very well, not very strongly. Its ability to predict discrimination is about typical of the weak effects common in social psychology, maybe a little weaker. And prediction is not the same thing as cause, right? And, anybody who's had one intro psych course knows that correlation is not causality. The one set of studies, there's one really great set of studies that tested a slew of interventions designed to change implicit bias, change IAT scores. And they succeeded. They reduce the implicit bias, which is the difference in time it takes to do black unpleasant, white pleasant versus black pleasant, white unpleasant. They successfully reduced that to a more equal reaction time, and it had no effect on their behavior. So there is no evidence that changing people's implicit biases has any effect on their behavior. So they really shouldn't be at best, they're implicit associations. Whether that's any sort of and anyone can see this. If people associate ham with cheese, is that a bias? That's ridiculous. Associations aren't biases. Okay, that doesn't involve people. How about the French and wine? If people associate the French with wine, is that a bias? It's like, no, there's like good wine in France. It's like, of course, if you know anything about France, that's what you do, So, if they associate football players with being large, it's like, again, make my head explode. Associations aren't biases. So calling what the implicit association test measures a bias is a deep misnomer.
And I think there's another element to this, because this wasn't something that was just floating around the ivory tower. Like, this was used by numerous corporations. I think over 20 million people took this test. Corporations, nonprofits, universities were using it. I think people were like screened for new hires. This was done in like DEI trainings. This was had a massive cultural impact.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's still all over the culture. I mean, DEI is now in retreat to some degree because of the Trump administration attacks on it. So I don't know how common it's still used. Even the advocates some time ago retreated from the claim, acknowledge that it's completely inappropriate to use the IET to screen people for jobs. It doesn't really tell you whether on the one hand, They long claimed that it measures unconscious racism, but then they also claimed you can't diagnose an individual's racism on the basis of the test. Those two claims are kind of incoherent, actually.
So, skip on to the next one. I want to talk about your work on stereotype accuracy, but first I'd like you to explain. I think it's just hilarious the way you explain stereotype threat research.
Well, sure. So there were two main lines of stereotype threat research. One, students and standardized achievement test scores. So the work started with the recognition that there was a large difference between black and white standardized test scores. So standardized tests, SATs, GREs, the sort of statewide tests that you have common in lots of states in high school. And that gap was about a full standard deviation, which is large. I'm not sure if it's still that high, but I think it's close still. So this is a phenomena that, was begging for an explanation. So the very first studies came along in the 1990s and produced this seemingly dramatic finding, which was, the idea, before I go into the finding, the idea was that, and the article was titled "A Threat in the Air," that it was so much a part of the culture that black people were genetically intellectually inferior, that if you frame these tests as assessing intellectual abilities, the black students taking it would feel threatened and anxious, and this would disrupt their ability to take the test, and so they would get lower scores. And so this threat in the air first set of studies administered a set of questions from the SATs, but I haven't looked at it. It might have been from the GREs. It might have been an IQ test. I don't really, at this point, I don't remember. Maybe 20 questions or so something like that. Don't quote me on that because I don't remember the exact number offhand. But they took a portion of a standardized test, and half of them were told that this was a cognitive ability test. This was a test of your intellectual skills. But half were given some other frame. I don't remember what it was like. It's about learning styles. It's about whatever. It was not framed as testing their intellectual skills. And they administered the test to both black students and white students. And the way the results were presented, it appeared as if you only got black-white differences when the test was framed as assessing their intellectual abilities. When it was framed in this gentler manner that didn't make reference to cognitive abilities, there was no black-white difference. That's how it was presented. But there was a problem. The problem was that, explain this simply, I think I can explain it simply. They controlled for their actual SAT scores when testing the effect of the stereotype threat intervention, right? So it's a cognitive ability test is a stereotype threat condition. It's just a test about, kind of learning styles or whatever it was, which was the non-threatening condition. When you control for prior test scores and then run this experiment, if there is no difference between groups, in this case, black and white students, controlling for their initial test scores, all that means is the initial score difference was maintained, right? I mean, if there's I'm inventing this now. If there's a 30-point difference to start with, and you control for it, so you eliminate the 30-point difference. So if there's a 30-point difference at the end and you eliminate it, it looks like there's no difference, but it's only because you're controlling for the 30-point difference to start with. So now they did get a difference in the threatening condition, which means if you believe that study, the difference did exacerbate, that the framing it as a test of intellectual abilities actually increased the black-white test score difference, if you take it at face value. But now that study's never been replicated. So no one knows whether it's replicable because no one's even attempted to replicate it, as far as I know. The second area of stereotype threat research was with women and math. It was sort of the same idea. Women are bad at, in the culture, there's this idea that women can't do math, they're bad at math and science. And so, when they take the math SAT score, if it's framed as, your math ability it's threatening to women, it activates the stereotypes, they can't focus, they do bad on the test. But when you frame it in some other more benevolent way, they do fine. Okay, so they did these initial studies, which were consistent with this. In the stereotype threat conditions, women perform worse than men. In the non-threatening conditions, have men and women perform about equally well. Okay, so this was so it's much easier to test this with a stereotype threat with men versus women than black versus white students, because there's just way more men and women. You could run this in any university, in any interest like subject poll. There's zillions of men and women. There may not be that many black students that you could get a large enough sample size to do it. This is actually not that easy to do. So there was zillions of studies of uh, stereotype threat in women in math. And they seemed to show that there was this stereotype threat effect until around 2014, 2015. Now, what happened was not, maybe the culture changed, but I don't think so. What happened was around 2010, 2011, ecology began to have what is now known as the replication crisis, which was famous study after famous study when subject to replication by independent researchers couldn't replicate the studies. And this happened over and over until eventually a field which tried to be in denial about it early on couldn't deny it any longer and started to reform how it conducts psychological science. One of the major reforms that emerged by around 2014, 2015 is something called pre-registration. So until that time, and it's to a large extent still now, researchers just do studies and they write it up, and however they write it up is how they write it up. And, it's kind of sort of taken at face value that they did what they said they did. And the problem with that is people could really make shit up after the fact. So there's lots of variations on this. One variation is, let's say I run 5 small-scale studies and 4 don't produce anything interesting, but 1 does. I can then, try to publish the one that did, but it's probably just a fluke because I ran 5 studies and most of them didn't work. But because that one worked, usually meaning it has some sort of statistically significant finding about some interesting topic, the literature will only have the one that worked, and no one will know about the 4 that failed. And that's how you can get a literature with lots of, findings that are nonsense. Okay, so pre-registration was developed to address this kind of problem. The way pre-registration works is, rather than cherry picking and making stuff after the fact, there's a written document stating exactly what you plan to do, what your hypotheses are, and how you plan to test them, what methods and statistics you're going to use to test your hypotheses or research question. Now, it's much more difficult for researchers to make shit up after the fact and to cherry pick results and studies. Because if you say in your pre-registration, there are 4 key tests, and this is how we're going to test them, and none of them come out, but you have 2 other things that are kind of different and kind of interesting, you can no longer write up a paper that says, we predicted these 2 things all along. Because you didn't. There's a record that you didn't. Now, you can do exploratory research and maybe you can publish it anyway, but you have to acknowledge in the write-up that you tested these 10 things and only 2 of them came out. Okay. This is relevant to stereotype threat because starting around 2014, 2015, some scientists started pre-registering their attempts to replicate stereotype threat with women in math. There are now 4 or 5, 6 of these pre-registered attempts to replicate stereotype threat with women in math. Every one has failed. That is, every one of them has failed to find the effect of this framing tests as testing math ability as undermining women's math performance. So I consider the pre-registered tests of any hypothesis, not just stereotype threat, far more credible than the general scientific literature. Because without pre-registration, you have no idea what the hell's going on. You have no idea how much cherry picking went on, how many other variables they assessed that aren't reported, how many studies they ran that they're not reporting. You have no idea. But when it's pre-registered, you know in advance exactly what was going on. And they've all failed. So I don't believe in the stereotype. The stereotype threat with women in math is not credible. It almost certainly doesn't happen now, and it probably didn't happen then. And I am dying for the pre-registered test of stereotype threat for Black and white students. I'm just dying for that study to be done.
That brings to mind something that I've seen you post about several times, and that is there's a huge push to claim there's a bias against women in STEM, and that seems to get slaughtered by the replication.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to make 2 points. I now know a lot about this literature, which I didn't 3 or 4 years ago. I knew some about this literature, but now I know quite a lot because my team recently had accepted for publication, it hasn't come out yet, an attempt to replicate this very influential, famous study that is reported having found what it called subtle biases against women in STEM. So they conducted this interesting study where they worked up a kind of like pretty good but not stellar resume of an undergraduate applying for a lab manager position in 3 science fields: physics, chemistry, and biology. And they administered, so the name on their resume was either John or Jennifer. It was an identical resume. Then they gave that resume to faculty in these 3 science fields, bio, physics, and chem, in 6 universities, 6 sort of elite universities. And what they found were biases against Jennifer. That is, John, whose resume was identical to Jennifer's, but John was rated as more competent, as they were more willing to hire or deserved to be hired. They weren't actually hiring anybody, so they were rated who deserved to be hired. So John was more deserving of being hired, and they offered John would recommend offering John higher salary and more mentorship than Jennifer. So this study, small sample, 127 faculty. It's not tiny, but it's pretty small. 6 universities. Paper was published in 2012, so they probably collected the data in 2010 or 2011. And in some ways, it was a well-done study, but it was so small, it should have been considered preliminary and suggestive, pending replication with larger samples, than like conclusive and like a major statement about the pervasiveness of biases in STEM. So I've long had doubts about that study. And 6 or 7 years ago, we started somewhere in 2019, 2020. I think that's right. I put together a team to replicate it. We did. We used a much larger, we actually conducted 3 attempted replications. The methods were nearly identical to the original study. So what I just described, we did. We had over 1,100 faculty from 55 universities around the country.
Whoa.
Yeah, no, the team worked its ass off. And not only did the subtle biases against women fail to materialize, we got the exact opposite. Well, it wasn't the exact opposite. That's probably an exaggeration. We got biases against men that were smaller than the biases against women that they found. So they found fairly large biases against women. They found consistent, statistically reliable biases against men, but they were small. They were pretty small in magnitude. They were not, they were not gigantic effects, but they were in the complete opposite direction. So that in the process of doing that, we had to attend not only very closely to the study we were replicating, but to the broader literature on sex biases in STEM. And there have been a number of these kinds of experimental studies where, people provide either vitas or resumes or some information about contenders, say, for academic jobs, vary the sex of the applicant, and then test for bias. And nearly all of those show biases against men. Not everyone, but nearly everyone.
How was your research received?
Well, it hasn't really been received yet because it's not published. So it's accepted, but they haven't published it yet. But it's published, I love this journal. This journal is called Meta Psychology. Meta science is like the scientific study of science, and it's mainly geared around improving, everything about science so that the conclusions reached in science are more credible and enduring. Important for psychology, which has a replication process. Meta Psychology is this journal that was inspired by the attempts to reform psychological science. So from my standpoint, this is a completely great journal to being published in because it's like my kind of journal. This is a journal that stands for rigor, that is about open practices and upgrading the quality of what psychologists produce. However, it's not like the most famous journal on earth. It's not like Science or Nature. And so really, even when it comes out, I suspect it will mostly be ignored because that's what happens to most academic papers.
You got the wrong conclusion.
Well, I also have a conclusion problem, and there is good evidence for that. A few years after the original study I just described, subtle biases against women for lab manager positions, Cornell team published 5 experiments with over 800 faculty participants rating. It was the same methodology where in this case, they provided, they did it in various ways, but they provided some information about the accomplishments of either a male or female applicant for a tenure track job. And they found this massive bias for women. The title was, faculty prefer women 2-to-1 in STEM fields. So that paper was published in the same journal as the subtle gender bias lab manager paper with 127 faculty. The lab manager paper, despite being like 1/6 the sample size is huge for methodological rigor and credibility, has been cited. So that paper was published in 2012. The second paper was published in 2015. So only looking at citations 2016 and later, right? You can't cite something till after it's published. Only looking at citations 2016 or later, the lab manager paper is cited like 5 or 6 times as much as the 2-to-1 paper. So yeah, I mean, it's absolutely the wrong conclusions.
So I have a hypothesis I want to run by you about at least a big reason for the replication crisis. I think it's a combination of political bias and this kind of publish or perish mentality. So if I want to submit something to a journal and I'm looking at a bias, is there a bias in favor of men or in favor of women? Like, I definitely want to get published because my career and my promotions are predicated on getting published, right? And, I also know that if the conclusion comes back that there's no difference in the bias, that's what we call the file drawer effect. It's kind of a boring study, so we don't publish it. If it comes back there's a bias against men, that's not really playing to the biases of the people running the journal. So I know before I even start the study, I kind of need to put a little bit of a thumb on the scale to get the conclusion that women are being discriminated against. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, it makes sense. But I think that's a little too manipulative. I don't think most people went that far. And I think what happened is more subtle, and for the most part. And on studies like this, you have to the extent there's a bias, it's a bias among the type of researchers who are going to study such a thing. Right. So someone who's skeptical of sexist biases in STEM is not likely to do a study saying it's possible, but it's much less likely to be motivated to do a study assessing sexist biases in STEM because you don't think there's much effect. So the people who were doing these studies were disproportionately, not always, but I suspect were disproportionately driven, essentially by something like social justice activism. They're pretty sure, oppression of various types, whether it's racial or gender or whatever, exists in the world. And so they're going to do the study to document it. And then they'll have the evidence that really is out in the world, and then they can use this to, try and advocate for all sorts of policy changes to advance women or Black people or whatever. And then putting a finger on the scale might have occurred, but if it occurred at all, it probably occurred in subtle ways. That I doubt they purposely did that. But when you work with like-minded people, and if your like-mindedness revolves around, beliefs in oppression or sexism and racism, you're going to be less skeptical and less careful about ensuring that the research is capable of disconfirming your preferred hypotheses
So
that you might otherwise be.
what I hear you saying is they weren't necessarily acting in bad faith, but they were true believers.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. Yeah, there are a small number of people who do act in bad faith, in my opinion, but for the most part, I think they're true believers. Yes, I think that's right.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering if you could touch on your work on stereotype accuracy.
So stereotype accuracy is really funny because I was publishing on it before I actually did empirical work on it. I did eventually do empirical work on it. So let me explain what I mean by that. In the 80s, early mid-80s, I was a grad student, started at Rutgers in 1987. Spans both those periods. I was doing work on stereotypes. Mainly stereotypes in person perception. So how do my stereotypes of your groups, sort of like the sex bias study, how do my stereotypes of your groups influence or bias my judgments of you? But in doing that work, I discovered, and remember, I was a grad student, I was learning the literatures at that point, that all over prior work in stereotypes were claims that stereotypes were inaccurate. And I didn't even doubt it. I mean, I'm assuming the literature is correct. Like, why would I doubt? I mean, I'm a social psychologist. I'm reading social psychology. I'm reading some sociology, occasionally some political science. It all says the same thing, that stereotypes are inaccurate. And I don't not believe it. I accept it. And I just wanted to be a good scholar. So I want to get to the original evidence demonstrating that stereotypes were inaccurate. There are all these claims. They're in scientific outlets. Scientific outlets are presumably based on evidence. So I would read these articles. They would have this claim that stereotypes are inaccurate. And then sometimes there wouldn't even be a reference. So it's like, now I would describe it as they're making shit up. Because in science, it's illegitimate. You can, but it's illegitimate to make a claim about an empirical state of affairs without empirical evidence. I mean, I could declare, I could write something saying aliens are about to invade the Earth. I mean, unless there's a fleet in the sky that's detectable, that no one on Earth sent, that aliens are not about to invade the Earth. That's an obvious case. But that was what was going on with some of the claims of inaccuracy. There were just these statements, and there was no evidence. There's no evidence. There was no evidence. Okay, but that's not the end there. Sometimes the articles did have a citation or reference to another article. So again, I'm not even skeptical yet. I'm just like, I want to get to the bottom of this. I would track down the articles cited in support of the claim that stereotypes are inaccurate. I would get those articles. When I would read those articles, there would be the claim that stereotypes are inaccurate, with neither empirical evidence nor citation to an article with empirical evidence. So it was like a citation writ, where somebody would make the claim, and then somebody else would cite the person who made the claim, and at the bottom, there was nothing.
I heard somebody call this like a citation cartel.
Yeah, that's what it has. Lots of there are names in the literature.
Circular referencing.
Yeah, circular referencing is the woozle effect, which comes from the Winnie the Pooh stories, where in one of the stories, Winnie the Pooh and his friends go out into the woods on a snowy day in search of a woozle, and they don't find anything. They start walking around, then they see some tracks, and they say, aha, the woozle, and they follow the tracks, and then there's more tracks, and there's another woozle, and they're just following their own tracks, which really captures this.
The bottom line seems, I think if you press some of these people, certainly some of them might acknowledge the lack of research, but I think the idea is like social justice declares this, therefore the strength of the evidence is not as important as you're making it out to be.
Yeah. Again, no one would ever say that in so many words.
Not out loud.
Yeah, right. They wouldn't say that out loud. But what they would do is come up with, quasi plausible sounding um, reasons not to believe stereotype accuracy literature. So that's sort of how that actually played out. But over the starting in the 1980s, there were a handful of studies before the 1980s, but starting in the 1980s, some people recognized that there were all these claims about the inaccuracy of stereotypes, and there was not a lot of empirical evidence, and people started doing studies. And again, I don't want to overstate this, um, but most studies which assessed all sorts of different kinds of stereotypes. I mean, the obvious ones are like sex and race and age and social class, but yeah, they assess stereotypes of fraternities and sororities, of different kinds of occupations, and there were just a zillion kinds of stereotypes assessed. The upshot of that literature was that, with some exceptions, in some ways, people's stereotypes were very, very accurate. In some ways, they were pretty good, but not quite that accurate. And occasionally they were pretty bad. So let's see here. There's a meta-analysis that just came out, like within the last year, titled "The Kernel of Truth in Gender Stereotypes. Consider the avocado, not the apple." So let me explain what that means. So for a long time, the only way you could acknowledge any accuracy in stereotypes was to refer to the kernel of truth hypothesis. So the kernel of truth hypothesis is the idea that even if stereotypes are wildly inaccurate and distorted, exaggerations and duped by propaganda, underneath it all, there's a kernel of truth. There's a little bit of truth. So, a great example of that is the Jews run the banks. The Jews don't really run banks. If you look at who runs banks, Jews are disproportionately unlikely to actually run banks. But socioeconomically, Jews are usually very successful in almost any country that doesn't actively oppress them. So that's an example of I think of a kernel as a kernel of corn. So you have this big cob, and there's a couple of kernels that are actually on target, right? That's the kernel of truth. This is the only way you can talk about accuracy. Okay. So this title, "The Kernel of Truth in Gender Stereotypes, Consider the Avocado, not the Apple," where apples have tiny little seeds, tiny little kernels, and the avocado has great big fat seed. That's the message of this meta-analysis, that gender stereotype, which is not by me, is by Alice Eagley and Judy Hall, who's a very prominent social psychologist. Eagley is incredibly influential and actually has social justice bona fides also. But yeah, the conclusion there is that gender stereotypes are high. Now, what that means is, so when people hear stereotypes, hear the term stereotype, they assume it's referring to cartoonish, simplified beliefs that other people ascribe to. Not them, but other people. But that's not how it's studied in literature. If I want to know your gender stereotypes, I'll ask you some questions about what you think about men and women. You might ask about their occupations or their personality or their attitudes, whatever it might be. And so when research like the Eagley and Hall meta-analysis concludes that gender stereotypes are accurate, it's not that these like cartoonish images of stereotypes are accurate. It's that what people actually believe about men and women is pretty accurate.
Does this go along with the gender equality paradox that you see in like the Scandinavian countries?
I have never thought about how this relates to that. But so the gender equality paradox is basically the more political equality a society has for men and women, the more gender differences emerge on all sorts of characteristics and preferences and occupations, right? But that's the gender, right? Okay. It could relate to this in that, most of these studies that Eagley and Hall analyzed are done in the United States. The United States is one of those countries that is, in the grand scheme of countries around the world, one of the most equal on social and political civil rights for men and women. And so that would, in the argument of the gender equality paradox, that means that whatever real differences there are between men and women would be likely to emerge, When there are differences, people are more likely to detect them. And that's how it would connect to stereotype accuracy, right? That people are very good at detecting differences between people and groups. They are good at that when they're in touch with those groups. One of the few areas where the best evidence is that people are wildly inaccurate is their beliefs about the personalities of people in foreign countries. So you can ask people, if you ask Americans about the personalities of Nigerians or Kazakhstanis, they're going to be almost completely out of touch with reality. But of course, they don't really know many Nigerians or Kazakhstan. So maybe that's not the explanation, but that could well be the explanation. But when you're talking about people within your own society and you can see differences between men and women or racial or ethnic groups, you can, again, not that people's beliefs are necessarily perfect. There's no evidence that people are perfect. And nobody should assume that even if the research generally shows accuracy in gender or racial or age or ethnic stereotypes, which it does, that that automatically means everything they believe about some group is correct. That is not true either. Nothing has ever shown that everything any person believes about groups is automatically 100% correct. Nothing shows that.
Interesting. So I have two questions left for you, and the first one is, what's that?
No, go ahead. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we have. I've been
Very wide
excited by this
range.
conversation for sure.
Yeah.
So the first question should be a softball for you. How do we fix the field of psychology?
So as I see it, the psychology has two main problems. And the first, people are working very hard on with some success. And that's these suboptimal methods and practices. Things like, running a million studies and just reporting the ones that are significant, statistically significant, and just pretending like the others never happened, that they never occurred. And so you get all this fake evidence in the literature. Pre-registration is the solution to that. Larger samples helps solve that because small samples are very noisy. You run a whole bunch of studies with small samples, and you're going to get something that looks like an amazing finding, but it's just because the um, uh, statistical features of small samples are very noisy. The results pop around all over the place. And so if you're cherry picking, you can find something that seems amazing. Those kinds of suboptimal practices are a lot of people are working on continuing to improve them, but a lot of improvements have been made since the onset of the replication crisis around 2011, 2012. The one I talked about was pre-registration, and that is a big one, but there are others. It's much more common for people to openly post their data now. So that's important because other people can then check whether the statistics they report were conducted, in a way that others can reproduce the same findings. There's a recognition that sample sizes need to be much larger so that the statistics are less noisy, less random nonsense going on. So there's a whole slew of these reforms that have gotten a fair amount of traction, and we probably won't know for another 5 or 10 years. But I mean, historically, the successful replication rate for pre-registered attempts in psychology is about 50%. So about half the studies replicate and half don't. Now, if it was pure noise, 5% would replicate. I can give the statistical justification for that. But so it's a lot better. It's not just noise out there. There's interesting stuff there, but 50% is still a very high replication failure rate. And actually, in my field of social psychology, it's closer to 60%. It may well be that 10 years from now, in 2035, when somebody looks at the replication rate, say post 2020, that it's no longer 50, maybe it's 30%. And I suspect it will have gone down from the 50% of the last 10 years or so. I don't know what it's going to go down to, but I suspect it. I think we've gotten better on methods and practices, and we are still getting better on those. There's ways to go, but we're going there. So that's good. The trajectory is good. Is it net good? I don't know if it's net good, but the trajectory is good. The second set of problems are political. The political problems are both scientific problems and problems that go well beyond scientific problems. So the field nearly all of the social sciences, is massively, massively left skewed, politically left skewed. So in social psychology, if you ask them to identify people to identify as left, center, or right, you get about 70 or 80% saying that they're left, and the rest scattered over, center and right. But if you ask them who they voted for, it's going to be 99%, 98, 99% vote for the Democrats. So the field skews heavily. And in addition, really across the fields, you have a crazy high level of not just people on the left, but people on the far left. So one of my former students, who's now a research scientist at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, his dissertation was a national survey of faculty. And among the things he asked was for them to politically identify themselves. 40% self-identify as Marxists, socialists, radicals, or activists. 40%.
What was the number of conservatives? Do you know?
I'd have to double check. It
It's probably
varied by
single
field.
digits.
Yeah, it was I think high single digits. Yeah.
So there's
But that's conservative. It's that comparison, it's 40%. It's not 40% Democrats. It's
yeah.
40% Marxists, radicals, activists, and socialists to about 7 or 8% conservatives.
So more than quadruple the number of conservatives Marxists compared to that's insane.
There's way more Marxists than there are conventional conservatives in academia.
That's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. It is worse. The actual numbers are probably worse than what that some might assume are the delusions of the most simplistic partisan Fox News viewers. That is, those people probably underestimate how extreme the skew is.
You hear people on the left say that, those on Fox News are delusional because they have this, kind of inflated idea of how radical academia is. And you're making the case, which I agree with, that they're really underselling it.
Yeah, they're underestimating. They almost definitely underestimate it. Yeah. Yeah. And there's good evidence, there's national survey evidence. Even for people on the left, the more skewed they believe academia is, the less credibility they give it. Because people get it. They want, for the most part, with exceptions, they want academia and scientists to produce things that are actually true. Even, they might, be congenial to your side, but most people don't want things congenial to their side that are bullshit. They want to know what the truth is, which is why the skew of academia has contributed to our decline. Okay, so it's a scientific problem because it screws with the science, leads to distortions in the way research is conducted. It leads to distortions, it leads to blind spots. It leads to, whether intentional or not, researchers kind of putting their fingers on the scale of how the results come out. It leads to people leaping to conclusions in the scientific literature. And so you get these canonized conclusions that everybody accepts as true that turn out to be false. Things like stereotype threat and implicit bias are like good examples of that. A good example of blind spots is left-wing authoritarianism. Social scientists started studying right-wing authoritarianism. It probably started in the 1930s.
This goes back to Adorno.
Yeah, Adorno really kicked it off big time in the 1950s. And then until about 10 years ago, or even less than 7 or 8 years ago, the claim common in the literature in social science and in social psychology and political science was that there's no such thing as a left-wing authoritarianism. There's no left-wing authoritarianism. And then 2016 or 17 or 18, 2 different teams developed scales, measures, survey questions to assess left-wing authoritarianism. And it wasn't really all that difficult. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't really all that difficult. And all of a sudden, you administer these scales and lots of people show up as high on measures of left-wing authoritarianism. But for 60 years, the disciplines were claiming there was no such thing. Couldn't find it. No, can't find it. That's an example of a blind spot. I suspect if the social sciences had 40% people on the right, somebody would have figured out how to measure it, back in the 1960s. Oh. So it's a scientific problem. It's absolutely a scientific problem. It's a scientific problem in canonization. What comes to be believed is true. The citation bias example that I gave earlier, where there are zillions of citations to the study finding biases against women, and like 1/6 or 1/7 the number of citations to the studies finding biases against men. So what you have is the literature filled with people making claims about biases against women, simply ignoring the evidence of biases against men. So, of course, if you simply ignore the evidence, you're going to have a scientific literature filled with claims about biases against women. So it's a scientific problem. But it's not just a scientific problem. It goes way beyond it. Academics, because so many are on the left and they're so used to being unfettered and unconstrained, many hate Republicans and people on the right. They sneer at them and they despise them. And eventually Republicans got the message. And now Trump is basically attacking academia. Some people, you could argue he's trying to reform academia, and maybe he is. Many people believe he's actually just, this is like a vindictive assault on academia for being so far. But this was inevitable. I mean, I and lots of other people, I have a long entry at my Substack site on Unsafe Science called "We Tried to Warn You," which lists over 100 just academics sources, papers and articles and chapters written by academics going back like 30, 35 years of people warning the rest of academia that being this politicized is unhealthy and is inviting a Republican or conservative backlash. In some ways, it's amazing that it took 30 years for it to come, but it is now here.
We've talked about several topics on here, but I think it's important to reiterate we're not talking about, most professors vote Democrat. Like there's a seething and passionate hatred of conservatives, Republicans, middle America, rural America. I mean, and they're letting you know it. They're trying to rub your face in it
Yeah.
every chance they get. They're
Yeah.
constantly trying to give most Americans the middle finger. Like, I don't know that everything Trump is doing is good, but when you look at how academia has behaved, it is absolutely predictable what happened.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I was one of the people who said it was going to come if we didn't clean up our act, because it was obvious. It was like, just if you think about it, right? If you tell half the country that you hate them and they're despicable, stupid people, eventually they'll hear you. If you keep doing it long enough, eventually they'll hear you. So. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's where we are. That's where we are. So it's created,
yeah.
it's created all sorts of other dysfunctions also. It was only in what I would describe as delusional mind of sort of a left-wing social justice activist that installing massive, expensive, and authoritarian DEI bureaucracies would produce something good. I mean, that sounds like if there was any check on that in universities, it would mostly never have happened. Or,
I mean,
it might have happened in a way that was far less draconian and expensive. There would have been checks and constraints on the way in which it was done.
like with the DEI thing, just as a kind of an oversimplification, like a big part of that is preaching this gospel and treating it as like part of your training that, men, 50% of the country are bad. White people, over 60% of the country are bad. Like a lot of people are just kind of go along with that for a little while, just to be polite because you don't want to stir things up. But that it has a shelf life,
Yes, yeah. No, I'm not. So we've been on this for a long time. We have this. So far, it's just an online report describing 3 experiments where we had people read DEI rhetoric based on the writings of Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility, and Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, or they read a completely neutral essay about growing corn. And when they got the DEI essay, they just saw the Kendi DiAngelo essay. We then gave them these like neutral interactions where they didn't even have race in the interaction. One involved an admissions officer interviewing and rejecting a candidate. That's basically what they got. But if they got the DEI rhetoric, they saw the admissions officer as committing more microaggressions as more biased, as more violent, as generally more unfair, that it should be punished. I mean, it led people to see stuff that wasn't there, bad stuff. So I would best describe him as a comrade in arms. We've never actually collaborated on anything. His name is Matt Burgess, a business related field, but just has a post on that's titled um, uh, a Substack toast, a post titled "Both Sides Are Losing Trump's War on Universities." And he's arguing that Trump is inflicting all sorts of damage, but the universities are doing nothing to reform. And so they're just going to incur, one, they need to reform and they're a mess. And if they don't acknowledge that they're a mess, they're just going to keep being a mess. But on top of that, now they have to deal with all the nonsense coming down from Trump. So the universities are screwed. But on the other hand, Trump is not actually accomplishing anything that he actually wants. And so his argument there is, if the worst of the problems in academia are in the worst of the politicization problems are in the social sciences and the humanities, which is probably true, Trump's responses are to defund STEM. Right. That's what most of the budget cuts to federal funding of grants is not going after humanities. The humanities don't get very much federal funding in for what they do, but biology does, physics does, chemistry does, and that's what's being defunded. So he argues it's completely misplaced. But he has this one line that this probably, even though it's his line, Matt Burgess is not my line, this is probably a good place to end. This heads up one of the sections in this unbelievably good post. Universities, despite purportedly dedicating themselves over the past decade to eradicating bigotry and promoting emotional well-being, have become national epicenters of bigotry and mental illness. That's just brilliant. And it's correct. It is absolutely right.
Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. When you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
I don't know. There's so many big things outside of the backyard of what I think about and what I do. I don't think I can really answer that. Noah Smith is the writer for Bloomberg News, but he also has an excellent Substack, has argued that things like people in China are embracing new technologies way faster than we are here. And that's, if that continues, that's kind of like a cultural stagnation that does not bode well for our future. I don't know whether I think that's true or not. I don't have enough information. I don't study China in that way. Um, uh, and sometimes you get these warnings. And, an open society like the United States actually responds well. The sort of the Sputnik moment in the 1950s when, oh my God, the Soviets are in space. What the hell are we going to do? Well, what we did was we turned it around and we got to the moon. So I think doom warnings are valuable because they allow course correction. So I don't know if he's right about that, but he might be. For most of the last 200 years, the United States, before the sort of soft cultural social justice revolution, for most of the prior 200 years, the United States sort of cultural identity was as a can-do people and as a can-do country. That was like, right? It was like that. It's American know-how, right? That's what the country was about. And whether it's, building trains and cars or the new high-tech, computers and engineering and I hope we continue that, but who the hell knows? And if we don't, that would be bad. It would be bad. But you never know when you're like, just a hair away from some horrible disaster. I mean, social media was I mean, I'm on X, so I don't know other social media platforms, but periodically erupts with, World War III memes, whenever something bad happens out in the world. So when Ukraine did this internal attack on one of Russia's military installations, the X blew up with, we're on the verge of World War III. When Israel attacked Iran and then when the United States bombed the Iran nuclear facility, again, X erupted with, we're on the verge of World War III. If we actually had an atomic World War III, that would be horrible. It would functionally send us back to the Stone Age if anybody survived at all. So you never know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I do like, you know what so Elon Musk, who in my opinion is a very flawed person, brilliant engineer, very bizarre politically, has argued, and I think he's right, that one of our priorities should be getting the hell off this planet. Because it's like an insurance policy. If we really fuck things up here, there's a backup plan. Until we do that, we have no backup plan. So I guess if I had to pick one thing, it would be that.
That's interesting. Dr. Justin, where can people find you?
Well, the easiest place is probably on Twitter. I tweet as PsychRabble. My handle is the Dark Pirate Jussim. There's a whole background story there on the cancellation attacks and stuff like that, which I'm not going to go into. I'm happy to go into that another time, but that would take too much. But I'm a professor at Rutgers. If you look me up, Rutgers, you'll get right to my Rutgers page. I have all sorts of stuff there, including publications and courses I teach. And then there's my Substack, Unsafe Science. So they're all, each one is connected to everything else. I'll go to Twitter when I have a new unsafe science post. My unsafe science posts sometimes refer to stuff going on Twitter. My Rutgers website refers to my blog site. So anyone will get you to all three.
Dr. Justin, this is a fantastic conversation. I was really fascinated by this. I'd love to talk to you again anytime.
Sounds great. Thank you.